Donna, should I go ahead and start? Okay. You all set? Okay.
I think the camera's rolling.
Yeah, it is, so I'll begin. Welcome everybody to our final class, so to speak, on the history of Jacksonville for the Matthew 25 initiative. This class is going to take us from consolidation, which I'm going to cover relatively briefly, and then bring us up into the 21st century. And in many ways, this is sort of the culmination of a story that we began last year by going back to the 16th century. And not to say that all of the seeds that we planted back then still bear on the city today, but I would say going back to the Civil War era and the aftermath of the Civil War era, we're going to see the reverberations of history still very much in our midst today. So it's important, as much as you can, to kind of draw these connections. The past is never past. As Faulkner said, the past isn't past. It's not even dead. It's very much alive in our midst, and if we only have eyes to see it. Keeping in mind, again, the issue here that we are focusing on in particular. This is not a comprehensive history of Jacksonville, nor is this a comprehensive history of consolidation, nor is it a comprehensive history of post-consolidation Jacksonville. I want to be mindful that I'm going to be leaving out some things like the Jaguars, although I'll touch on them, that you might wonder, how is he not talking about the arrival of the Jaguars in 1993? I will gesture to that, but I'm focused on what has been our theme since last year, which has been issues that would fall under the kind of the heading of what Matthew 25 focuses on. Issues of race, racial justice, issues kind of affecting, quote, the least of these in our community. And always being mindful that this is not merely a history class, although I don't, in this particular class, emphasize the role of the church. One of the themes has been, since last year, the fundamental role the church has played and not played in many of these issues. And so I want to keep us mindful that when I raise issues of lingering racial and public health and economic inequalities in our community, these aren't just social or political issues. For me anyway, as a Christian, they are inherently moral and human issues. And so I think it's important just to keep that background in mind, even though my language won't be explicitly foregrounding those moral implications. So if you recall, last week we finished with me reading the judge's basically a report of the grand jury statement about widespread corruption in the city of Jacksonville. And the judge was basically calling Jacksonville to account that its politicians have been looking out for themselves and their own pocketbooks rather than the greater good of the city. And one of the issues that was propelling Jacksonville towards consolidation was widespread government corruption. But it wasn't just that. As we said last week, in 1964, 15 of Jacksonville's high schools, all of Jacksonville's high schools were disaccredited. And we said that of the 67 counties in the state of Florida, Jacksonville, more specifically Duval County, ranked 67th in per capita money allocated to public education. And even the Times-Union, which you would not call at that time a progressive or liberal paper, took the city to task for what they called its selfishness. Jacksonville seemed like a city more interested in recruiting business and emphasizing its low tax base than investing in the future of public education. And as the Times-Union said, we've reaped the whirlwind and we have now disaccredited public schools. So you had public school disaccreditation, you had government corruption. Then, as we said, you had a city, Jacksonville, that was actually losing population throughout the 1960s. 1960, Jacksonville had a population of a little over 200,000 people. By 1965, it has dropped to under 200,000 to about 198,000. All the while, what is happening in the county, Duval County, is growing by leaps and bounds. We are beginning to see the suburbanization of Northeast Florida, and particularly in Duval County. If you grew up in Duval County, and I know we have a handful, I should say, of Jacksonville, Duval County natives here, and of those who were here a very long time will remember that in rural Duval County, and there are still, believe it or not, portions of Duval County that are rural, but it used to be commonplace, and that was basically an area made up of dairy farms, tree farms, and that by the 60s, particularly by the 70s, is becoming increasingly suburbanized. And what we're seeing is during the 60s and 70s a phenomenon called white flight, that is, residents of Jacksonville leaving the city to move out into the suburbs. But it's not just white residents who are moving out into the suburbs. We've said that there were some inner city black residents, whether that was because of the interstate being developed through La Villa, other rehabilitation projects, or just simply displacement. They are also moving out into Duval County. And so the consequence is Duval County's population is growing, Jacksonville's is decreasing. And this is very important and consequential for the city because that means a shrinking tax base. All the while, Jacksonville's tax base is shrinking, its budget is growing by leaps and bounds. And there's this problem that city leaders and business leaders begin to recognize, and that is, as Duval County's population grows, that doesn't mean the people who are living in Duval County outside of Jacksonville are not using Jacksonville resources. They're coming to Jacksonville to shop. They're commuting to Jacksonville to work. And they are relying on infrastructure and amenities and facilities that require tax dollars, and yet their tax money is not going to support those very things that are being used in Jacksonville. And so you have this quandary, a shrinking tax base, a growing budget. All the while, as I said, you have government corruption, you have discreditation of public schools, and then on top of it all, you have a very complex and unwieldy system of government in Jacksonville and in the county. In Jacksonville during this time, you had not only a city council, but you had a city commission. City council during this time was basically the legislative branch. The city commission is the executive branch, although where those boundaries ended and the other began was oftentimes very difficult to determine. You had a very weak mayor. In short, you had these divided responsibilities, and no one was ever quite sure whose responsibilities lay where. And oftentimes you had city council and city commission and other branches going to court against one another to figure out who was responsible. And because of that confusion over responsibility, it created a system where it was kind of easy to engage in corruption. On top of that, Jacksonville had, amongst all cities in the United States, the highest number of city employees of any city in the United States for its size. So we had 3,241 employees. Again, a city that had a major budget problem has too much government, too many employees, and it is an ineffectual government. It is clearly, and again, it's ineffectual in part because of its structure, this commission, council, mayor system. But it has also been ineffective, as we've seen in past classes, because of leadership, particularly in the mayor's office, and more specifically, Mayor Hayden Burns. We saw that in great evidence during the civil rights protests of the 1960s. And however, we're going to see that change when we have Mayor Lou Ritter and then especially Mayor Hans Tanzler. We'll see more robust leadership that will guide the city through consolidation. So rather than spending the majority of our time then getting into the weeds of consolidation, I just want to leave you with those big issues. The issue of corruption, the issue of public school disaccreditation, the issue of government waste, government complexity. This is an issue on top of the budgetary issues, the financial issues that are very real for the city and then for business in Jacksonville that are leading the city towards a movement towards consolidation. And consolidation, it is interesting to note, is in many ways a movement that began, and many people call it a kind of quiet revolution. There's a book about consolidation written by a Times Union journalist named Richard Martin. It's called Quiet Revolution. In effect, it really was. It was a radical attempt to say, we are going to start over again here in Jacksonville. Government is not serving the interest of the people. We're scrapping the system and building something entirely new. It's a kind of revolution that I don't think we can kind of conceive of happening today. But it's important to note that it was really kind of led from the top. Claude Yates, a CEO with Southern Bell at the time, J.J. Jack Daniel, a businessman with long and deep roots in Jacksonville. These were the two men that kind of led it. And many people have said, whenever you study Jacksonville history, so goes Jacksonville and so goes the business community. This was a kind of almost elite movement that was very important in the sense that though it was led by the elite of Jacksonville, they were the ones who put it into motion. And for some people, they were saying, well, of course, the business elite of Jacksonville put consolidation into movement. They had the most to lose. They wanted to see their businesses thrive. And in Jacksonville, with the people leaving the city and the city in financial straits, they had a lot to lose, and so were much interested in changing that. But it's also important to note that J.J. Daniel and Claude Yates and other leaders, particularly the man, sort of the mastermind behind this, Lex Hester, they were very intent in getting the community involved. They did not want to, as J.J. Daniel said, go to some northern advisor group that would come down and tell us how to do it here in Jacksonville. They wanted, in a sense, for the people to to lead, in a sense, the consolidation movement. They wanted experts that were from the city, not, again, advisory groups coming from the outside telling us how to do it. In order for the people to have buy-in, they didn't want this to be a kind of distant, elite-driven process by people who didn't live here. And so the committee was very important in getting input from a variety of people in the community, a diverse cross-section of Jacksonville, and in bringing in people like Sally Mathis, someone I'll talk about a little bit later, to spread the message of consolidation into the Black community. And so this is, in many ways, getting grassroots support for consolidation will eventually explain, despite a lot of tension in the community, there were vigorous protests against consolidation. Here you can see in downtown Jacksonville a photograph of the warring sides in this debate, the Citizens for Better Government, aka the White Hats. They were pro-consolidation. Their office directly across the street from the Better Government of Duval County, the anti-consolidation or the Black Hats. The anti-consolidation movement was basically saying, this sounds to us like a communist plot, which is a little ironic given that Claude Yates and J.J. Daniel were leading it, two men who could be in no way categorized as communists, but the centralization of power. You're telling us we need to create a unified, strong mayoral system, a strong executive. This seemed to be changing a decentralized system into a centralized system in which the executive had too much power. This was going to lead to a kind of local dictatorship, it was feared. Nevertheless, despite those arguments, the anti-consolidation forces lost, and in August of 1967, basically 65% of residents voted for consolidation. So August 1967 is a major turning point in Jacksonville's history as the city votes overwhelmingly for consolidation. And it's important to note that one of the other reasons sometimes you will hear that the city was moving towards consolidating county and city government is because of changing demographics. Not only was there a population loss, but with white flight, it was thought by the 70s perhaps, particularly by the early 70s, that Jacksonville could have, for the first time since 1913, a Black majority population. And so for many Black people in Jacksonville, there was reasonable concern that consolidation was an attempt, in a sense, to dilute Black political power. Because in the city of Jacksonville, as I said, it was nearly a 50-50 split between Black and white residents. Whereas in rural Duval County, or I should say just in Duval County more broadly, there was a decided white majority population. And so it was people like Sally Mathis and even Earl Johnson, who I'll introduce you to in a little bit, who were basically recruiting in the black community and saying, look, yes, if consolidation happens, black people will go from being a near majority to being once again a minority and roughly 27% of the population. On the other hand, the gospel of consolidation was basically saying, if the city can get its finances in order, if we can begin to build our tax revenue base once again, we are going to have money to pave the roads in Jacksonville's black communities, to bring sewer lines and water into black communities in Jacksonville. Without a city that was financially strapped is not going to be able to do that. A city on the brink of financial ruin is not going to be able to do that. Now, if you're willing to trade potential political power for those government infrastructure programs, we think consolidation will be in your best interest. And so that in part is what galvanized the black community to vote in the majority for consolidation. Even though today you will oftentimes hear consolidation was primarily driven by these fears of black political power. Now, that is part of it. But it is not the only part. As we've said, it was a multi-pronged issue that involved glaring problems across the board that were leading towards consolidation. But that racial dynamic is important, and it's one we're going to pick up with in just a little bit, because the question that we're really going to focus on today is, what did consolidation do and what did it not do? I think today you hear a lot of people are beginning to say, well, consolidation failed. And you oftentimes hear that in terms of the promises that were not kept by consolidation governments, particularly in revitalizing neglected neighborhoods. And if you've been following the negotiations over the new stadium deal, you know that part of the stadium deal within that deal is money to set aside for not just neglected neighborhoods like Northwest Jacksonville on the east side, but communities across the city. And this is, as Mayor Deegan has said, a way to make the promises of consolidation real. And so if that's the case, well, we can already see perhaps examples of where consolidation did not quite meet its true expectations. But we'll see, it's going to be a conflicted legacy. Like all of American history and like all history, it is not all great and it is not all bad. We oftentimes have a very difficult, I think in general, many people have a difficulty with gray areas. They like it to be all glorious, or they want to emphasize all the wrong that needs to be rectified. But in reality, history isn't like that. We're involved with human beings, and there's going to be greatness, and there's going to be quite the opposite at times. All right, so as I said, Jacksonville consolidates officially. Now, the voters vote for consolidation in August of 1967. It is not until October of 1968 that Jacksonville is officially, Duval County are officially consolidated. But we're already beginning to see the seeds of a new political system before October of 1968. Now, the next photograph I'm going to show you, I was somewhat joking. I was like, can I show this at church? But I'm going to show it at church. It is one of the most iconic photographs of post-consolidation Jacksonville. And here is Mayor Hans Tanzler. Mayor Hans Tanzler is elected in November of 1967. He is the reform candidate. He beats Lou Ritter, a man that was relatively popular and did a great deal more for the city of Jacksonville than Hayden Burns, but Lou Ritter was a one-term mayor. Hans Tanzler was a former UF basketball star, tall, charming, handsome. As one writer said, the sort of the definition of a Southern gentleman. And his charisma helped him defeat Ritter in '67. And here is Hans Tanzler. And this is on San Jose Boulevard, so State Road 13, right as you go over the Julington Creek Bridge. And it just so happened during this week of consolidation, at the Alhambra, an actress named Lee Meredith was performing. And someone had it in their minds that this would make a really good photo opportunity for this actress to come with the mayor to put up this new sign, this new, symbol of Jacksonville's growth, and here the bold city, the New South. And this photograph was taken by a Times Union photographer, and it just has all the elements of unintended comedy and symbolism that I won't go into here. But Jacksonville does indeed begin to proclaim itself as the bold new city of the South, and we have a lot of things that play on that phrase today. And again, our question is, well, how bold was Jacksonville? How much did it truly become a bold new city of the South after consolidation? So here you can see that Jacksonville's former borders are in red. This was the former outline of the city of Jacksonville, and after consolidation, aside from the beaches in Baldwin, which of course vote to retain their own autonomous governments, but nevertheless have fire service, nevertheless can vote for mayor. Aside from the beaches and then Baldwin, the far western half of Duval County, all of Duval County becomes, in a sense, Jacksonville. We become overnight the largest city land area-wise in the lower 48, overtaking Oklahoma City and Jacksonville to this day, other than Alaska, and again, in the lower 48, the contiguous U.S., is the largest city land area-wise in the nation. And this will present a lot of opportunities, but many people say this also is going to lead to what people say is another problem, and that is we create a new form of government with the city council that is in many ways governing much too large of an area, much too diverse of an area, and cannot be as receptive and responsive to all citizens' needs in a city of this size. And so our size perhaps becomes an impediment to our boldness, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, as I said, Mayor Hans Tanzler is voted into office in November of 1967. But that election is also an historic election, not only because there is a vigorous spirit in Jacksonville for change. There's a desire to move on from the scandals of the past, the corruption of the past, the wasteful government, the ineffective government, school disaccreditation. So not only is Hans Tanzler elected as the reform candidate, but so are 3 black city council people. The first 3 black city council people to serve in Jacksonville since 1907. So 60 years has elapsed, and we call those 60 years the Jim Crow era in Jacksonville. And it's important to note that this election not only saw 3 black city councilmen elected, it saw the first women elected to Jacksonville City Council. Here on the left, you have Earl Johnson. Earl Johnson was an attorney who in the early 1960s led the legal challenge to Jacksonville's segregated, or I should say Duval County's segregated public school system. He was sort of the crusading lawyer who was taking a recalcitrant and resistant county school board or school system to court to effectively desegregate Jacksonville's public schools, and suffered tremendous amounts of blowback, even death threats for doing that. In 1967, that very man is elected to a city council seat, not just any city council seat, it was an at-large city council seat. That is, in order to get elected, Earl Johnson had to get substantial amounts of white voters to support him. And in fact, they did and elected him in the office. I just find this incredibly astounding, because if you go back just 4 or 5 years in time, as I said, Earl Johnson, in the minds of many white voters, was public enemy number 1. He is trying to lead this crusade to tell us what we have to do in our schools. They're going to take power from parents to decide who their children sit next to, and they're going to force us to desegregate our schools. And now he has been elected to Jacksonville City Council with substantial black support. This is Sally Mathis, and Sally Mathis, and as well as Mary Singleton, they were elected into council districts that were from effectively black areas. Particularly Sally Mathis. Mary Singleton was a little bit more suspicious of consolidation. She was one of those who said, this seems like a plot to strip political power from black residents. whereas Sally Mathis was an ardent supporter of consolidation. And yet they both become critically important voices, not only for the black community, but for women's interest in Jacksonville during the 1960s and into the 70s and even the 1980s. A few years after the election of not only Mary Hans Tanzler, but this new city council, Harper's Magazine, a monthly magazine that was, I think, still was widely read, but particularly during that time, they did a story on Jacksonville 4 years after consolidation. And they started their story in 1971 by focusing on Earl Johnson, this man who led the campaign to desegregate Jacksonville's public schools, the man who was then elected to city council in 1967. In 1971, Earl Johnson moved to Mandarin. And Harper's Magazine really wanted to emphasize this, to talk about how much Jacksonville had changed since the early 1960s. And the story was that Earl Johnson, when he moved into his Mandarin home, Mandarin at the time, as it largely is today, was overwhelmingly white, and Earl Johnson moved into an all-white neighborhood. But Earl Johnson said, when I moved into the neighborhood, one of my neighbors had her chauffeur drive over to my house, and the chauffeur got out of the car and walked up and brought me a cake. And this was a way of welcoming me to this neighborhood in Mandarin. And this is what Earl Johnson said. He said, our relationships with the neighbors have been more than good. I would have to say excellent. The only criticism I've heard has come from my black friends who claim I copped out by moving all the way from downtown. So what the writer of the Harper's piece basically was arguing, he said, if you know Jacksonville, and he's writing for a national audience, you probably know Jacksonville for all the wrong reasons. You know Jacksonville because of what happened in the 1960s, as I'll talk about in just a minute. You know Jacksonville is one of the most polluted cities in the nation, one of the worst smelling cities in the nation, but I want to emphasize to you that Jacksonville has changed. Jacksonville is a model for how to improve and reform government. And Earl Johnson and his house in Mandarin and the reception he is receiving from his white neighbors, this is a microcosm of how much Jacksonville has changed. Now, anytime you write something like that, you are in many ways setting yourself up to be a fool, because no city can claim the mantle of having a perfect form of government or a perfect new relationship between the races. And so it perhaps is inevitable that Jacksonville was not going to live up to this praise. And in fact, it doesn't. Just a couple of weeks after that story runs in Harper's Magazine, in June of 1971, a 15-year-old boy named Donnie Ray Hall is out with his friends. Donnie Ray Hall's father has allowed him to take his car out for a drive, and Donnie Ray Hall and his friends are going up what is today the Haines Street Expressway near the east side, and they are pulled over by a policeman who is suspicious, and he looks at Donnie Ray Hall and thinks that Donnie Ray Hall has stolen this car. Now, Donnie Ray Hall has been in and out of juvenile detention. He has a sort of illustrious past, so to speak. But when he sees the police officer, Donnie Ray Hall pulls over, gets out of the car, and immediately runs. And a police officer named Frank Foraker fired a warning shot, and then as Hall continued to run, shot him in the back and killed him. It was assumed Donnie Ray Hall was carrying a gun. It was found that Donnie Ray Hall had no gun. He was unarmed. This set off 3 days of rioting in Jacksonville, and Jacksonville once again becomes a national focus. Remember 1960 with Axe Handle Saturday. Jacksonville was ground zero in the civil rights movement. 1964, we had already talked about because of Mayor Hayden Burns' refusal to negotiate with civil rights leaders. Jacksonville exploded into violence in 1964. 1971 was an extraordinarily tumultuous year, and again, the irony, it comes just a couple of weeks after perhaps one of the most praiseworthy pieces of journalism ever written about the city. And it once again opened wounds that had been slowly healing in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. So we all know here in 2015 15, you perhaps remember the name of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin, in many ways, is the young man, 17-year-old young black man who was killed in Sanford, Florida by George Zimmerman. And this killing basically is what sets off what becomes known as the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, for Jacksonville's black youth, Donnie Ray Hall was Trayvon Martin. Donnie Ray Hall was someone that could have been them, and in many ways they had seen other examples of this, and it led to anger. Black pastors in the NAACP, a couple of days after his killing, lead a peaceful and nonviolent march to the Duval County Courthouse. And in the march, they are carrying a coffin. On the side of the coffin, it says Donnie Ray Hall. Unfortunately, despite that nonviolent protest, many of the youth associated or were on the periphery of that march begin to riot. And they begin to riot because close to where the march was happening, another black driver is pulled over and he's arrested and put in a patrol car for having expired tags. And the youth said, they're antagonizing us again. And this leads to 3 days of rioting. For some people in Jacksonville, this was absolute lawlessness and pandemonium. For others in Jacksonville, this was a powder keg destined to explode. This is what happens when the voiceless are not heard, they said, and they have no other recourse than, in their minds, destruction. And so the city was divided along these lines. In many ways, sort of the core issue was forgotten. So that year, 1971, is a kind of critical turning point year because I'm going to show you in just a little bit Jacksonville's perception, at least among its citizens, of improving race relations and declining race relations will kind of peak and fall over a number of years. And you can see certain events that are the instigating events that sort of just rupture and tear the community apart. And that, the killing of Donnie Ray Hall, was one of those events. Now, in the aftermath of that, Hans Tanzler, to his great credit, is going to community meetings. Unlike Mayor Hayden Burns, Hans Tanzler was willing to sit down with black pastors, black churches, black community leaders, and to listen. And Hans Tanzler went to these communities and, as much as he could, tried to internalize what he was hearing. And what he was hearing, and others' studies were revealing, is that many black residents continued to feel that there was an oppositional relationship between them and the police. During the early 1970s, 93% of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office was white, and many black people wanted to see more representation on the force. In addition to that, there were arguments in the black community that unnecessary force was being used all too frequently. And a 1981 study by the Jacksonville Urban League said that 83% of Jacksonville's black residents had either personally experienced or personally witnessed the unnecessary use of force or violence. That was, according to a study in 1981, 83% of the city's black residents had either personally experienced or witnessed unnecessary violence or use of force. And so what they were saying is, we want more representation in the JSO, and we want better relationships between the black community and the police. Now, what is also important to recognize here is that these same respondents said, this is not the problem of everyone in the JSO. Jacksonville's black residents said 2/3 of at least I should say 2/3 of Jacksonville's black residents said, most of the JSO is great. The bad apples are the few, the minority of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and yet those few bad apples are rampant, and they are, in some sense, oftentimes unchecked, and they wanted to see the bad apples reined in and removed. So this, in many ways, in the 1970s, in addition to the issues of public education, and desegregation, and busing, in addition to those issues, relationship between the black community and the police was a very important issue growing out of the civil rights movement. And I should point out, this is not unique to the 1970s. If you go back and read the Florida Times-Union going back into the 19th century, these are very, very old issues that take on a new form during this particular time in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Revolution of the 60s. All right, so it's really in the 1980s that we begin to see actual reforms being implemented. And in part, a new mayor in the 1980s, a man named Jake Godbold. Jake Godbold was born and raised in Jacksonville. He grew up in public housing in Jacksonville, in a public housing for white residents. So Jake Godbold was sort of what one person has said is the last Southern populist mayor, a man who came from very humble background but was very much a reformer. And Jake Godbold went to great lengths to change city employment so that there was greater black representation in Jacksonville's city employee, amongst Jacksonville city employees, as well as within the JSO. But nevertheless, despite what Jake Godbold was doing, Jacksonville continued to deal with problems of racism. Here is a chart. This is from a study done by the Jacksonville Community Council, Inc., the JCCI. And this, as you can see, percentage of Jacksonville residents who believe racism is a problem in Jacksonville between 1985 and 1991. If you could roll this back into the 1970s, that number would be much higher, but in 1985, 24% of white Jacksonville residents believed that racism was a problem. 46% of black Jacksonville residents believed that racism was a problem in the 1980s. But you can see here, slowly during Godbold's administration, those numbers go down. By 86, you have, in some sense, the lowest. You take in consideration here the black response as well, sort of the lowest or the best view of race relations in Jacksonville really during the 20th century. So the mid-80s is sort of when the community itself felt like great amount of change, although not perfect change, but a substantial amount of change was coming so that these numbers reached their lowest ebb. And then they begin to rise again and rise rapidly. They worsen. And I always tell my students, history, when you're dealing with human beings, is not a neat story of persistent and inevitable progress. We as human beings are not inevitably moving towards greater and greater perfection. We as human beings don't always remember and understand our past mistakes and try to improve, although we like to think that's why we study history, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. History doesn't work like that. Human beings don't work like that. We as individuals don't always work like that. And so this chart should give us pause as you go from sort of the best year of 1986 into one of the worst years in 1991. So you might be asking, what's going on in 1990 and 91 that is leading to the deterioration of race relations in Jacksonville? Well, I'm going to give you a brief overview, and I'm just going to highlight a few things. I don't know specifically what made 1991 a particularly grievous turning point in the history of Jacksonville's race relations. But in 1991, a known and avowed Neptune Beach white supremacist, shot and killed a black man who was a veteran of Operation Desert Storm. In 1991, some Jacksonville white youths dressed up as Ku Klux Klansmen and went into neighborhoods with new black residents and burned crosses in their yards. In 1991, Duval County Judge John Santora gave an interview with the Florida Times-Union in which Judge Santora said interracial marriage is wrong and should not happen. The judge also said that black women are notorious welfare cheats and that black kids are held to lower behavioral standards than white kids and are problems. All three of these things, once again, put Jacksonville on center stage. And how is it, people began to wonder, that there's a judge in Duval County and that believes that interracial marriage, which has been constitutional since 1967, should not happen. Well, this created an uproar. And it's important to note that at the time, the Times Union, unlike today, the Times Union back then had one of the most conservative editorial pages in the United States. And even the Florida Times Union editorial page came out and said this is reprehensible and Judge Santoro should step down. And eventually the Florida Supreme Court removed Judge Santoro from the bench. In addition to all of this, in the early 1990s, really by the mid-80s and the late 80s, we are seeing the influx of crack cocaine into many inner city neighborhoods. This is leading to more violence, particularly gang violence, which is going hand in hand with growing tensions once again between the black community and the police as well. And so once again, these tensions, I think, and the problem of deterioration of inner city neighborhoods, growing crime, growing gang activity, is also leading to a perception of more troubling race relations in the city during this time. All right, so by 1993, and you can't see it here, but by 1993, 2/3 of Jacksonville's population, 2/3 of Jacksonville residents, regardless of race, believe that racism and race relations is of paramount importance. It is the primary problem in the city. And so we've traveled a long way between 1971, when Harper's Magazine is painting this picture of Jacksonville as a model southern city that has changed its bad reputation in terms of race relations. And look at Earl Johnson, the former lawyer who brought desegregation to town. He's living in an all-white neighborhood in the south side of Jacksonville, to Jacksonville once again emphasizing racism and race relations as one of the city's primary problems. But as Jacksonville is wont to do, on the other hand, just 2 years later, Jacksonville elects its first black sheriff, and this is Nathaniel Nat Glover. So 1995, just 2 years after the JCCI report said that the primary problem in Jacksonville is race relations and racism, Jacksonville, with substantial support from white voters, elects its first black sheriff. If you have not read or have not seen Nat Glover's new book, Striving for Justice, The Black Sheriff in the Deep South, it is a fantastic overview, not only of Nat Glover's life, but of Jacksonville from the mid part of the 20th century up to the present day and his role as sheriff in Jacksonville during this time. If y'all were here for the class on Axe Handle Saturday, you might remember that Nat Glover was downtown that day on August 27th, 1960. He was working downtown. If you recall, Nat Glover walked up to a Jacksonville police officer, and the police officer basically said to Nat Glover, if you want to survive, you better get out of town, you better leave. And so I've always found it this really fascinating kind of full circle where that very young kid who, along with everybody else that day, was fearing for their lives, suddenly becomes the man who is the top law enforcement official in this city. Of course, today we have another black sheriff, that is T.K. Waters, but Nat Glover was the first. And so here, and I remember this is about the time where I'm getting a sense of appreciation. I am late high school, early college, reading about Jacksonville, and with a sense of pride, I remember watching television shows, reading other national publications that were writing about the election of Nat Glover and how much Jacksonville had changed. Because I remember being in high school, I had a burgeoning interest in history, and a little bit with local history, but primarily just Southern history more broadly. And I remember frequently there were Ku Klux Klan marches downtown, and I remember thinking, my God, why is this happening in my city in the 1990s? And so the election of Nat Turner felt like a page had been turned. But as we're going to see, that was a very important election, both symbolically and practically, but it does not solve the problems of lingering inequality. And so what I want to leave us with here before I move into the present day is that we cannot blame consolidation, the failure of consolidation, for the ongoing issues we have in our community with race relations or ongoing issues in our community with health or racial disparities. The problems of ongoing poverty, of ongoing racial tension, these are problems that are not merely the responsibility of local government. They are a responsibility of individuals. They can be responsibilities of state, even federal government. And so if we put too much weight on consolidation on Jacksonville, I think consolidation is inevitably going to fail. It could not have been a cure-all for the city's very, very deep-rooted problems. And again, much of what I'm talking about here today is not unique to Jacksonville either. These are problems cities north and south, east and west have dealt with. They've just dealt with them in different ways. But what I want to conclude with here are let's take the story now from the late 20th century and into the early 21st century. And again, these are the issues I would argue are not merely about policy, but for me personally anyway, are things that cut to the core of my faith about how we are to see our neighbor and how we are to respond to our neighbor. In a sense, it's the very essence of the Golden Rule. And so I want to highlight some of the issues, again, in keeping with the focus of Matthew 25. If you cannot see this chart shows the racial disparity among kids living in poverty. So in Jacksonville, and this is now about a decade old, so I could not find more up-to-date information. But in 2013, there were a total of 50,880 kids living in poverty in Jacksonville. So nearly 1/4 of the children in Jacksonville lived in poverty. Of all of the kids who lived in poverty, 58.7%, so nearly 60% of all the kids in poverty in Jacksonville were black. 32% of the kids who lived in poverty were white, 9% were other. Married parent families with children living in poverty. So in this sense, you have two-headed households, two parents in a household, and you have, interestingly here, of the parents who are living in poverty, 57% of those families were white. A minority in that case were black families. But it's quite the reverse when you look at single mothers living with children. So amongst single mothers with children who were living in poverty, nearly 64% of those families were black, whereas about 1/3 were white. I mentioned this last time, but it's important to bear repeating. Northeast Florida infant mortality. Jacksonville continues to have, Duval County more specifically, continues to have one of the higher infant mortality rates in the state of Florida. We are above the state average, while at the same time we are one of the highest percentages of cities our size in the United States. And here you can see the infant mortality breakdown based upon race. And so this is 2015 to 2021. And you can see there the discrepancies between infant mortality. I don't know what accounted for the rise there in 2018, particularly for black mothers and children, but that is something that calls out for addressing. Related to that then, if you survive infancy, what is the life expectancy of people living in Duval County? Once again, we see the effects of history. We see the effects of policies. These are not any one administration's policies. These have deep, deep roots that go back beyond the 20th century. But what's important to point out here, if you cannot see it, these are broken down by zones. So the zone with the lowest life expectancy in Duval County of 71 years is Zone 1, which is in red. Zone 1 is Northwest Jacksonville, aka the urban core. That incorporates the east side and the northwest side. These are the old, primarily black neighborhoods of Jacksonville, almost exclusively black neighborhoods of Jacksonville. And then you go down and you come into our area. We are in zone 6. The life expectancy here is 79 years. I will say that the life expectancy in the beaches area is brought down a little bit because the life expectancy in portions of Mayport is substantially lower than it is in other parts of the beaches. And so that in part explains why the beaches are not as high as, say, the southeast side, and including Mandarin, which has the highest. And so it's important to point out here, there is almost a 10-year difference between zone 1 and zone 3 in terms of life expectancy. And we see that in other health factors as well. This is age-adjusted heart disease mortality rates. And in many ways, that goes hand in hand with the life expectancy rates as well. If you can't see that, again, age-adjusted heart disease mortality rate per 100,000. Duval County's average is 188 out of every 100,000. Florida, the breakdown is 153 per 100,000. So if we go to zone 1, nearly 250 per 100,000. And again, these sort of map onto the life expectancy zones. And so this is a snapshot of the effects of, I would argue, history that leads to Jim Crow policies. We might remember a couple of weeks ago talking about redlining, housing covenants that effectively made home ownership in Zone 1 virtually impossible. Zone 1 is the zone where, as late as today, there are still roads that have not been paved. There are still homes without water service and sewage service that still use septic tanks. So we've already seen, going back to the 40s and 50s, Jacksonville studies carried out by city government that saw a direct correlation between housing conditions and health outcomes. So if that was true in the 40s and 50s, it's stunning to see, though not surprising to see, the reverberations today in the 21st century. Now, this last issue I will show you, this is something called the socioeconomic status. And this takes into consideration a whole host of factors. First off, when this system here of a kind of well-functioning or, quote, healthy society versus the opposite, it is taking into consideration the percentage of single female households with children, so single mother households, residents with a high school degree or higher, so the percentage of residents with a high school degree or higher, literacy, residents below poverty in the past 20 months, so it's taking in consideration the poverty rate, vacant housing units, no vehicle available for household, owner-occupied house value less than $50,000, percentage of residents unemployed, the median household income, population. So when you take all of those things into consideration, the areas in red are in the lowest socioeconomic index, the lowest community well-being. And again, you can see here at the beach that stretches up to Mayport. And then places to the west of Mayport Road in Atlantic Beach. So again, the geography here is suggestive of history as well, residential patterns that are ingrained in the city's past.
Scott?
Yes?
What year was that again?
Yes, so this study was published in 2019. And if anybody's interested, Donna, I'll send it out. It's 100 pages long, so you can read more. Okay, so you're getting the thumbnail sketch here, but it is from a 2019 study.
But that image is impactful, and maybe that would have interest to the folks in the group that are meeting on Thursday. Floanne? I don't know. I'll catch you.
Sure. Well, I know that, of course, we do a lot with food here at Palms, and I will just point out, I don't have a food desert map, but if I showed you a food desert map of Duval County, the food deserts would effectively blanket the red shaded areas. So it's a direct, and that's not part of one of the index values that go into this map. But if you added food scarcity in addition to food deserts, they would effectively go on top of all of the red areas. And so again, these are deep-rooted, multifaceted problems. And when you hear people use this word that sometimes can cause the hairs to go up on the backs of people's necks, which is systemic or systematic, that is what is being referred to. Sometimes that word is tossed around willy-nilly. It's sort of a buzzword, and many people kind of shut off because, oh, I'm going to get a political stump speech about something. But I would just say, if you hear that word systemic or systematic, in effect, this is what we're talking about, that there are systems of law, systems of economics, systems of jobs and job availability. The other thing here that people don't put into the socioeconomic index is not just poverty rate, but also access to good paying jobs and ease of access. Oftentimes, transportation is a problem. That the issue of vehicle ownership is a problem in getting to jobs, and you have to rely on public transportation. Well, you're relying on a bus, and sometimes that means crossing vast distances, which makes it very, very difficult. Most of my students, I teach at the downtown campus of FSCJ. Most of my students come from these red and orange shaded areas. The vast majority struggle to get to school. They have to rely on public transportation. Luckily, the Jacksonville JTA bus station is right across the street. I have really bright students, and it just, again, for me personally, as a Christian, I hear my students saying, and I'll talk to them about where I live, oh, you live at the beach, my God, it's like a magical land, that you know, another world, another city. And they say, I just want to live in a city. I had one student this semester who says, I want to live in a city. I want to live in a neighborhood where I can walk down the street and not feel as though I might not come back. And it's just this kid who is 18 years old, an incredibly bright student, who just came out and said it one day. We were talking about a separate topic, a separate issue related to American history. And he basically just said, no, well, I can relate to this because I just don't feel safe where I live. I don't feel like I can be what I want to be where I live. And it's important to note, in these red shaded areas, an vanishingly small percentage of young people are able to transcend and move up the socioeconomic ladder from where they are. I think it's about less than 5% of young kids who grow up in the red shaded areas will ever advance up the socioeconomic ladder outside of that situation. And trust me, it is not because they don't want to. It is because they don't have the resources or don't believe they have the resources, don't know where to find the resources. Everything that we take for granted and that I have taken for granted and that my daughter takes for granted is very much absent from their lives.
You said less than 5%?
Less than 5%. So socioeconomic mobility, another factor that's not put in here, is not there, and it's very real.
The other issue is that what we are learning here today and what your students are learning from you, the majority of the kids in this city will never learn this in the schools today. They won't. They'll only have their sole perspective of what is happening in their world and not what is happening in the greater picture.
Yeah, well,
That's devastating.
well, it's, you know, for us in teaching the Jacksonville history course at FSCJ, I mean, one of the things that we believe that in order to have city vitality and well-being, you need to have knowledge of local history. Studies have shown, and there's been a proliferation of studies in the last 15 to 20 years of charting indexes of community well-being with community knowledge. That knowledge of your community and knowledge of its past goes hand in hand with civic engagement and civic well-being. There's a very scientific correlation between the two. And so what we're trying to do at a very modest level at FSCJ is to say, okay, students in Duval County Public Schools, for good reasons or not good reasons, are not getting Jacksonville history. They may get Florida history, but why are they not learning about the place that shapes their lives most intimately, and all of our lives most intimately? We are a city. It's not just students who grow up in Jacksonville and live in these areas, but particularly out here at the beach and particularly east of the St. Johns River, we are ever more so a city of migrants and newcomers. And most people come to Florida, and particularly Jacksonville, and don't really care to know about the new places they're living. They just want to enjoy Florida and all the amenities that it brings. We believe that if you have a substantial portion of the city's population who is coming just to retire, for a better life, for new jobs, they too should have an opportunity to learn about their city's past so that they can be invested in its future. How we make that more accessible, how we make it more widely accessible is something we're trying to figure out at FSCJ, but we really believe that in part, not exclusively, but in part, so much of, and again, these colors are byproducts of history. They're the reverberations of history, that we need people to kind of understand both the good and the not so good of our city's past so that we have a sort of shared sense, a common purpose, how we make the city best for everybody. And I think that's the other thing to kind of take away here. One of the things I oftentimes hear too as well, when people move here, they have the vague sense that it's bad on the northwest side of Jacksonville. Everything is bad on the northwest side of Jacksonville, and the people who live on the northwest side of Jacksonville become the kind of quintessential others. That's their problem. That's where the violence happens. Thank God it's not affecting us, and may it never. I think what I oftentimes, whether that's new students moving into the community or otherwise, I try to emphasize that what happens in Northwest Jacksonville affects everyone. We are bound together in this web of interdependence, and that is both reality, that is just the economic web, you could argue, that's public health, as we saw in the pandemic, but at a fundamental spiritual level, I believe that is, we are connected intimately by God, that what happens to the least, what happens to someone else, also happens to me, and that bears that responsibility not to turn away. And thankfully we are at a church and have people who are very much engaged in doing that very thing at the local level, at the international level as well. Pam?
I wanted to give another example.
Yes.
Repeat.
Yes, I will. Here, Pam, I'm actually going to give you the mic because I think that's a better way to do it.
That's awful sweet.
Yes.
Hey, so I wanted to give another example about similar to your student, that said he didn't feel safe. And my area has always been maternal child nursing. And Scott's put up some very disparate numbers in terms of the difference between infant mortality of whites versus blacks. And I have had students who, when they become pregnant, it's just a fact that their baby may not live. And I never felt that, and my children are 50 years old almost. And my daughter never, yes, we can lose a baby, but this is like, that's what happens to a number of some of my black students at University of North Florida. And that has just been so powerful to me to think that there are so many children, babies that are lost. So just another example.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, and I think anyone who has been involved in social service, whether on a volunteer level or professionally, cannot help but kind of run into these issues and ask yourself, Jacksonville today, again, you look at it in quality of life, you look at it in our economy that is luring people to the city. Jacksonville is ranking as one of the best places to move to. It is one of the premier cities. We're becoming something not unlike what Raleigh and Nashville and other southern cities have become in recent years, a destination spot, and even for young people. And all of that is all well and good. We're going to have a new stadium. Hopefully the Jaguars manage to be respectable for the next 30 years. However, I think we oftentimes, when we see all these good things happening in the city, it is not to marginalize them or to give them short shrift, but it is important just to keep this in the back of our minds, and particularly we as people of faith who, again, I don't need to tell you all the moral dimensions of these issues, but I do think it's something that I even try to do in my classes. I'm very upfront with my students when I talk about history. I tell them that though I cannot lead you in a public prayer according to the Supreme Court, I nevertheless can tell you about my Christian faith and how that informs how I understand not how history happens, but the implications of history. I became a historian because I saw people, whether it was in the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, various reform movements, who took their Christian faith and lived it out. And so that's what I communicate to my students as well, that history should not be about collection of facts, should not be a question of merely interpretation. It's what do you do with that knowledge? And I think that at the end of the day, I hope is what students take from a class like this. Yes?
Isn't the child mortality rate also closely tied to teenage pregnancy?
Yes. Pam, you would probably know that more than me, but I think there's a pretty substantial correlation between infant mortality and teenage pregnancy. Pam is saying yes. Yes.
And how much of that is related to choice for abortion?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Here.
I was wondering how much of the infant mortality is related to the choice for abortion. I remember back in 1966, when I was working in an abortion law passed, and I know there was a great deal of talk about, gee, at least the young black gals will no longer have to use coat hangers to do their abortions. They could get their abortions safely. And that was, I mean, obviously, I'm not young anymore, and I remember that so well, and what a difference it made in their lives.
I don't really know the exact number of that. It was the figures that I was quoting related to actual newborn infants, and that did not survive.
Right.
But you bring up a very significant.
So yeah, that the infant mortality, it's important to recognize, is not directly correlated with abortion per se, but yes. Did you have another? Yes.
What is your relationship between blacks and whites in your classes?
What is the relationship between black students and white students in my classes? Generally, it's fine. I don't notice any tension. I will say that I teach American history courses, I teach Florida history courses occasionally, I teach Jacksonville history courses, but I also teach at the downtown campus African American history courses, which for me as a white person, I have to navigate some potential minefields at times. And I say that, I do this because, well, that was partly what I was trained in graduate school, but I'm also the only full-time historian at the downtown campus. But what's interesting to me is when I teach those African American history classes, 98% of my students are black. Whereas my American history students, I would say it's about a 50-50 mix. So it's always interesting to me, well, why aren't more white students taking African American history? And the white students I do get are almost always white students I've had from other past classes. And so we've got a relationship, they want to take another class with me, and so they take the class. I virtually never have a white student take an African American history course that I do not know. So that means a couple of things. It could mean, well, that's the demographics of downtown campus, but not quite. That could mean there's just not a lot of interest. When people see an African American history class, they assume, well, that's for them and not me, and don't take it. But when white students do take it, I often have really good conversations that develop between black students and white students. And most of my black students are amazed. Virtually none has ever said, well, I don't think you should be able to teach black history, you're not black. What they do say is, I didn't think a white person would be interested in my history. Or they're amazed when white students take African American history and like, oh wow, you want to take this class too? So there is this perception, even amongst black students, that white students wouldn't want to take this class. But in general, the dynamic between black and white students, but also not just black and white. The downtown campus has many international students, and so I have international students who are taking Jacksonville history or American history. And they, more than anyone, oftentimes are amazed by much of the history that we talk about in class, the good and the bad. So that's somewhere the best discussions happen. Yes?
Racial attitudes. Do you have any stats that indicate whether the arrival of the Jacksonville Jaguars and the high percentage of blacks has had any implication of racial attitudes in Jacksonville?
So is there a relationship between the arrival of the Jaguars and perhaps the improvement of race relations in Jacksonville? I don't have anything. The last evidence I have for a survey of attitudes about race relations were that figure I gave you from 1993. Of course, we get the Jaguars in the second half of 1993, so that survey would not have counted it. But the early 90s, as we said, were a sort of very low point in the city's history in terms of how people perceived race relations. I don't know. My gut, and maybe some other people would have this perception too, is that I believe for some people in the black community, particularly who lived near and perhaps lived on the east side, for instance, were able to maybe work for the Jaguars or work at the stadium. Maybe they saw that as a benefit. I know that there have been other community groups like the North Side Coalition that for a very long time has said the Jaguars has basically diverted money from addressing these long-standing community issues and put them into the stadium, put them into a product that the vast majority of people who live in the Northwest Side and the East Side can't afford to go to. So they would, in some sense, maybe say, well, that's for the people who can afford tickets to go to see an NFL game. And why is it that, nevertheless, the communities surrounding the stadium continue to crumble? The stadium is in a red-shaded area. Well, okay, have we invested in that community, or are we investing in an NFL team exclusively? So I think even now, that goes back to the early 90s when we got the Jaguars, and those concerns are very much still present in debates about the new stadium deal. Thus, the Deegan administration's effort to make sure that there is money set aside for these community development programs. Well, I know we have gone over. I just want to touch on one last thing very quickly. I didn't get to the environment, but you will be happy to know that our river by the mid-1970s was not full of waste and pollution, and so much so that Mayor Hans Tanzler agreed to ski on the St. Johns River in this day in 1977, along with two women, I forgot, it wasn't Weeki Wachee, from some other Florida, Cypress Gardens, yes. Thank you, Donna. So Jacksonville's river pollution improved, but in terms of environment, in the 1980s, Jacksonville had a reputation as the city that stinks. The joke was you smelled Jacksonville before you saw it. Whether you were on I-95 coming north or heading south, or some people even said in airplanes that people, when the airplanes got close to the airport, the smell from the pulp mills would come into the airplanes. So in the 1980s, a new mayoral administration under Mayor Tommy Hazouri began to make very big penalties, upwards of $10,000 to companies that polluted the air. And Tommy Hazzuri knew he had public support behind him and said, if you don't like these penalties for pollution, leave. We don't want you in Jacksonville. So Tommy Hazzuri had some bravado and really played an important role in cleaning up Jacksonville's air pollution. And believe it or not, we used to have tolls at all of our bridges, and even on JTB. If you were coming from in town to the beach, you had to stop basically about where Kernan Boulevard is today. There used to be tolls, and you backed up as you waited to pay the tolls to come further east on JTB. And so Tommy Hazzuri believed that the tolls, and he was right, created traffic congestion, which then created air pollution. Didn't quite solve the problem, but nevertheless was an important achievement for Mayor Hazzuri. So the post-consolidation movement led to better mayors, stronger mayors, at least in terms of the environment where things did begin to slowly improve. I don't have time to go into this, but I was going to leave you with Jacksonville's perception. It is a city that we know as a southern city, but it is a city whose cultural identity has changed. Jacksonville, during when I was growing up, and even before that, was known as South Georgia. Whoops, where am I going here? Jacksonville used to be known as South Georgia, a city that never quite lived up to its potential. That was sort of a derogatory name. These are names of various areas of Florida. You can see here Jacksonville, South Georgia. It had a reputation for just being a little bit parochial and backwater, but that begins to change rapidly in the 80s and 90s. And yet Jacksonville retained its southern identity. This is a map showing where, believe it or not, telephone directories, where the number of businesses begin with Southern rather than American. And a sociologist at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, would go through telephone directories and look at the number of businesses called Southern versus American to determine what is the identity of that place. And so the boundary for Southern, where the majority of businesses compared to American were Southern businesses, is right at the Duval County, St. Johns County line. And as we move into the 20th century, into the 21st century, geographers continue to draw the line of Southern culture, and even the Southern accent. Basically, it is running right over our heads. This is a map of Southern accents. Where is the native Southern accent, both black and white Southern accent? Not people who move into the city, but people who grew up in the city who speak a Southern accent. The Southern accent, according to this map, ends when you go about a half mile down the road. Here in Jacksonville, the old joke goes that it's the river that divides the Southern accent, and a more specific map shows that Jacksonville, the Southern accent east of the St. Johns River, my generation, my daughter's generation, the Southern accent is gone, and it's gone forever. The St. Johns River on the other side, however, you can still have vestiges of the Southern accent. And we had a family member who used to come over for Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners, and he lived in Riverside, and he would always say, well, it's time for the Wallace family to go back to the redneck side of the river, which meant the west side of the St. Johns River. And so I wanted to get into the changing cultural composition of Jacksonville, how we're still a southern city in terms of our latitude, of course, but our reputation for being a deep south city culturally is changing as the city's demographics change. The southern accent is dying out. We are a city that has, throughout the 20th century, had a majority of citizens born in Florida or Georgia. That's no longer the case. In Jacksonville, as late as 1940, majority of its citizens were born in Georgia, not Florida. Now the majority of our citizens are born primarily in the north or outside of the south. And so that has implications for the changing culture of Jacksonville as well. So that was a very quick overview of something I did not have time to get to, but didn't want to leave you without at least touching on it. So we are done. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. This has been so
Now you get to smell.
Oh, you're welcome.
You get to smell
Thank you.
Mississippi.
Yeah,
With all the papers.
oh, I bet. Yeah. Well, you're right. Any place with paper mills
Yeah, paper.
or with four.
The whole state is all paper mill.
Exactly. Oh, I believe it.
They had them too.
I believe it.
So Scott, for this, we're working on developing a beaches, a way for the different NGOs and faith-based and government to communicate and cooperate.
Yeah.